As the senior commercial officer in Australia, among my many duties, one of my roles is to oversee Commerce's foreign direct investment program, basically promoting inward investment into the United States. So we help facilitate and help Australian companies that are interested in investing in the United States. Just to give you a bit of perspective on this relationship, the two-way investment between the United States and Australia is a whopping 1.3 trillion Australian dollars. And the U.S. is by far the largest investor in Australia. And in the same token, the U.S. is the largest destination of Australian investment. In addition, U.S. companies employ a staggering 320,000 Australians, the largest foreign employer in the United States. So if you're an Australian company and you end up investing in the United States, you will have good company with lots of Australians in the United States already there. Today, we're going to hear a few examples on how Australian companies, businesses in the clean tech sector are succeeding in the United States. The United States is among the fastest growing international clean tech markets and is creating opportunities for more and more businesses like yours to flourish. And clean tech is a top priority of the Biden administration. On December 8th, 2021, President Biden signed an executive order to reduce emissions across federal operations and also to invest in American clean energy industries and in manufacturing and create clean, healthy, and resilient companies. The president is building on this whole of government effort to tackle climate crisis in a way that creates well-paying jobs, grow industries, and makes the country more economically competitive. Today, the Biden-Harris administration is also making major leaps forward in wind, solar, transmission, and other clean energy projects to create high-quality jobs and deliverable, affordable, carbon pollution-free electricity across the United States. And you'll hear, as you'll hear in a few minutes, Australian companies also have an excellent reputation in the United States market. For example, Redflow with its battery technology in California and PowerLedger with its blockchain technology are already bringing innovative solutions to the U.S. market. Also, just 2 weeks ago, President Biden, alongside Jane Hunter, who was here with us today on this webinar, announced Tritium's plan to open up a manufacturing facility in Tennessee. So we're all looking forward to hearing from Jane in a few moments. And so without further ado, let's get to the speakers. So I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Mark. And we'll go to Duncan now to share information about Select USA resources.
Thanks very much, Georgie. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming on board and hearing about opportunities in the US tech sector. I, alongside Georgie Harrawell, manage the Select USA program here in Australia. And essentially, what I want to chat to you about is two parts today. One is the research that we can provide Australian companies who are looking at the US market. And the second that Georgie will cover is the Select USA Summit, which is happening in June in the States. And we're recruiting an Australian delegation for that. But if we just turn very quickly to the research that we can provide. So again, Select USA is a US federal government initiative aimed at helping Australian companies who want to set up in the US. So I'm an Aussie working for the US government, and the services that we provide, which is mainly around research and the concierge service, are all free. So essentially, when an Australian company is looking at the US market and thinking, gee, it's a very large market, great opportunities, but there are at least 50 states, I'm not quite sure where I want to go and set up and where the opportunities are, we can engage with our research team, because essentially Commerce generates a lot of analysis on the domestic US market, and we can repurpose it on behalf of Australian companies to provide reports and information, concrete information that would give an Australian company better clarity on where they might want to go and set up in the US. So for example, we can give information on labour clusters, technology clusters, if you're looking for specific skills in your labour pool. We can provide information on energy clusters where you might find, cheap, accessible energy for whatever enterprise you're putting on. We can provide information on transport hubs that are all going to give you, based on your set of criteria, a much fairer and firmer idea of where you want to set up. So at the end of a particular research project that we can turn around, and they turn them around very quickly, rather than looking at 50 states, we can go based on the information that you're providing us about what's important to your business. We can provide you and say, these are the top 4 states that we think you should go and have a conversation with. Because as a lot of you, I'm sure, are aware, a lot of taxation, a lot of the regulations happens at the state and sometimes at the county level. So really, you want to be speaking to the economic development officers in those individual states. The good news is all of those economic development officers are super hungry for new business, and they will all want to speak to you and provide that sort of granular micro information that's going to be relevant for you wanting to go and set up and incorporate in that state. So that's the research part. The other part of it is we provide that concierge service, if you will, to those economic development officers at the state level, because we have good contacts with all of them. So we can sort of help you. We ain't a panacea. We're not a panacea for all of the issues that might come up, but we are certainly, if you're at that stage where you're looking and you're not quite sure where to set up in the States, we can be a very useful tool. With that, I could go on, but I'm going to pass it over to Georgie to talk a little bit about the Select USA Summit in June. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Duncan. So we're taking an Australian delegation to Select US Summit this June. So the dates are 26th to the 29th, and it will be an in-person event, which will be great. So it's the premier annual event dedicated to promoting foreign direct investment. So every economic development agency will be represented. So a great opportunity for you to organise one-on-one meetings with those different agencies if you're unsure where to set up. This year, the Select USA Summit recognises the importance of global climate priorities and has organised sessions this year to bring together stakeholders in key clean tech energy and related sectors, such as advanced batteries, energy storage, civil nuclear energy, offshore wind and semiconductors. So I'm sure those topics will be of great relevance to the people on the call today. The event will also feature a Select USA Tech component, which is taking place virtually, and it will also host the Select Global Women in Tech Mentorship Network, so a fantastic opportunity for women around the world to connect with high growth startups and potential partners. So we look forward to sharing more information about the summit after this webinar. As you can see from the slide here, we've taken Australians to DC to this event for many years. They've really enjoyed not only the opportunity to hear from the breakout sessions and preliminary sessions of other successful companies doing business in the States, but also it's a really unique opportunity to connect with one another and learn from one another. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Joanna Oliveira now from Bondi Partners. It's great to have you moderate today's event. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you, Georgie, and thank you, Duncan and Mark and the Select USA team for hosting this event today. And welcome to you all online. Thank you very much for joining us for this US Commercial Service webinar focused on Australian leaders succeeding in the US market. I'm Joanna Oliveira. I'm a director at Bondi Partners Australia. Bondi Partners is a strategic advisory firm focused on the US and Australian markets. We work with leaders across both the US and Australia on helping them grow in either market, working across a number of different industry sectors. We were founded 2 years ago by Ambassador Joe Hockey when he finished up his term as Australian Ambassador to the US. We have teams in Washington, DC, LA, Sydney, and Canberra. It's fantastic to be with you here today, and I'm super excited for the panelists that we have joining us today. We have such a great group of leaders who will be able to share their experiences about the US. Before I start, I do want to make a note. We have two of our founders who are based in Queensland, which we did want to send our best to everyone across the nation who are in Queensland or Northern New South Wales, hoping that you are all staying safe. So we want to send our best to you all. So today's webinar, we will be touching on, what our business leaders are doing in the US, how they're doing it, and touching on the lessons learned and advice as you might seek to grow your business in the US. So we'd like to start, first of all, with some introductions. As you heard, we have 4 panelists who will be joining us. So in order, we'll start with Jane Hunter, CEO of Tritium. We'll then pass to Tim Harris, CEO of Redflow, then to Dr. Gemma Green, co-founder of PowerLedger, and then to Patrick Fazzoni, who's the attorney at Washington Global Law. So Jane, if we could pass to you first for an introduction of yourself and on your company, and then moving on to Tim, Dr. Gemma, and Patrick. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jo, and thank you for inviting Tritium to be on the panel. As you mentioned, our thoughts are with all of the Queenslanders and now New South Wales people who've been impacted by the floods. It's a tricky time for everybody, both in their homes and businesses who've been impacted by the extreme weather event. But today we're certainly excited to be here to talk about Tritium's business in the United States on the panel. I'm Jane Hunter, I'm the CEO of Tritium. I joined Tritium in late 2019. Prior to that, I was the COO of Boeing's International Phantom Works division, which is their disruptive advanced technology division with business in Saudi, India, Korea, Australia and the UK, as well as, of course, the US, being Boeing, which is a large American organisation. So I have experience both working in a US global corporate and now working in an Australian corporation, which is doing business in the US. So crossing both ways in terms of that trade. In terms of Phantom Works, we had a focus on autonomous aerial and underwater systems and the mission systems that drive those UAVs and UUVs and sense technology. And now I'm in another disruptive technology company, this time in Cleantech. Tritium designs, builds and supports fast DC chargers for electric vehicles. We currently have #1 market share in Australia, New Zealand, and #2 in North America for DC fast chargers. About half of our revenue comes from Europe and North America, and the remaining 14% comes from the Asia Pacific region, so it's a smaller third market for us. Tritium has a technology moat. We've got the only fully liquid-cooled charger on the market, and that enables a high uptime and a small footprint, and we're the only ingress protection 65 rated charger that's currently available. So that's been a key advantage for us. And we're an Australian company listed on the NASDAQ. We listed under the DCFC ticker in January. I'll hand back to you, Jo.
Thank you, Jane. And Tim, we'll go to you next for an introduction.
Hi, everyone, and great to be here on this important forum. My name's Tim Harris. I'm the CEO and Managing Director of Redflow. Redflow is an ASX company that's focused on energy storage, and as we move to a renewable-based energy world, energy storage really sits at the heart of that. We design and manufacture what's called a flow battery, and we specialise in one chemistry, which is called zinc bromide. And we're really the leaders in our field around this. We've been going for about 15 years. And that's been about $140 million in terms of technology and commercialising it to date. And so we have about 180 deployments around the world and some of the sort of largest element of operational history behind our technology. The US is the key market and focus for us. We have a flagship project, which is a 2 megawatt hour project for a company called Energia, which is building North America's largest waste to energy plant in California. And that's really serving as our beachhead to expand into the US energy storage market. The overall energy storage market is kind of growing at about 30% year on year, and it's going to be well over 1,500 gigawatt hours by 2030, and half of that is going to be in the US. And within the US, California is going to be the leader in terms of energy storage adoption, with some very strong state mandates in terms of renewable energy penetration out to 2030 and 2045. So we were delighted yesterday to announce our formal team that were established in California, and we believe that the US holds enormous opportunity for us, and we're very excited, to be another proudly Brisbane headquartered company alongside Tritium to really start to branch ourselves into the US market. We see a very exciting future for us there. So delighted to be here and to contribute to the conversation.
Thank you, Tim. And Dr. Gemma Green, will pass to you now.
Thank you. PowerLedger is a technology company. We make software for trading electricity, focused on allowing renewables to be scaled without causing problems on the grid. Around the world, most of the renewables that we've seen in our electricity grids has been installed via government subsidies, which has resulted in higher electricity costs, but also because of these feed-in tariffs, which are very blunt price signals. A lot of renewable energy has been installed not where it's needed and not when it's needed, which has resulted in increased network spend in the grid and also increased grid stabilisation costs. And you can see this phenomena where countries or regions that have a high penetration of renewable energy also have the highest electricity costs in the world. And it's most pronounced in Germany, which has 53% renewable energy and also the highest electricity costs in the world. So there's a strong positive correlation with this centralised price signals, subsidies, and high electricity costs. And we see this as being a part of the reason why there's backlash against renewables, but it doesn't have to be that way. And if you can create local price signals that take account of the ability for the grid to incorporate a certain amount of renewables in a particular part of the grid, local energy markets, so that renewables can be scaled without government subsidy, then you can have high penetration of renewables with low electricity costs. And that's really the premise of our software. And we partner with electricity network providers, electricity retailers, and also multinationals who have made commitments around renewable energy to spin up markets, local energy markets, peer-to-peer trading, and also enable the ability to trade renewable energy certificates, all in the ambition to get to 24/7 renewable energy in a way that is low cost and low carbon. Because also, ironically, in countries that have high penetration of renewables, they can have high carbon emissions if they're supplementing their energy with high carbon intensity electricity. And that is also part of this phenomena driven by centralised and subsidised price signals. In the US, we've been partnering with a entity called MRETS, the Midwest Renewable Energy Tracking System, which is the largest renewable energy certificate registry in the US. It covers 9 states, but also holds most of the voluntary renewable energy certificates. Renewable energy certificate is representative of 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy generated. And what we're seeing now is the corporate leaders around the world are going beyond 100% renewable targets to 24/7 carbon-free energy targets. And the difference between that is that if you're doing 100% renewable, you might just match your renewable energy buying annually. So, for example, say you're operating in New York, you might buy a renewable energy certificate from Texas to cover that volume of energy. Or say you're operating in California and you're using energy in April, you might buy a certificate that was generated in January. And when you have small amounts of renewable energy in your grid, it doesn't really cause a problem. But as companies and regions have started to get high penetration, if there's oversupply at that level, it causes issues. And so that's why we have a lot of curtailment, which is pretty much a fancy word for throwing energy away. And this is really a poor economic outcome. So, in some places in the US, you will have, like, for example, in Texas, you have at times too much wind, so they're curtailing that, which is a real shame and a lost economic opportunity. So the partnership with MRETS is around adding hourly intervals to the RECs so that companies are able to match their renewable energy certificate buying against their energy load profile. And if they're in New York on a Wednesday and they're consuming energy at 7 p.m, they're actually buying either a power purchase agreement or an unbundled renewable energy certificate at that time, at that place. And that's really the premise of what we're doing. We're solving the time and place problem, both at the energy level and the certificate level. And we have about 20 clients in 10 countries. And very delighted to be a part of the panel and also wanted to acknowledge Tritium for the fabulous listing on the NASDAQ. Really, it's very impressive.
Thank you, Gemma. And Patrick, can I go to you now for an introduction?
Yes, yeah, thanks, Joe. And it's Patrick Fazzone. I'm a co-founder of the Washington Global Law Group. We do work with a large number of Australian companies wanting to do business in the United States across various different sectors. And I'm here today, I think, just to recount some experiences from various different companies in the cleantech sectors. I guess, my purpose in life is to try to help ensure that those companies succeed in their business plans. And so to anticipate and address issues that might arise as they do business in the United States. It's a delight to be here today and to share the panel with these wonderful experts in this area.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, thank you all for those introductions. Jane, I would like to go to you first. You've had a massive year so far, and I have to say big congratulations to you and the team at Tritium. What a great start to the year with the NASDAQ listing, your announcement with President Biden. I'm sure that we can all say that it's fantastic to see an Australian company doing what you're doing. So a big congratulations. We'd like to hear a bit more about your journey to the US so far. If you could share a bit more about the past month, but also about your work in the US to date.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. Thanks for those good wishes, and thanks, Gemma, as well. Yeah, it's obviously has been a huge start to the year for us, a long time in the making. So we had started to consider how the company would scale and gain access to capital to keep our market share at the end of 2020. And at that stage, we looked, across different listing opportunities. We also looked at the potential of a trade sale of the company. And, I'm really pleased to be at the position that we're at today, which is that we've managed to keep being an Australian company, and we've listed on the NASDAQ, which is really exactly the outcome we were hoping for. But certainly it's been a lengthy process. We announced in May of 2021 that we were going to list, and we listed in January. So it's certainly a complex and not an inexpensive process for a company to go through, but with the right partnership and backing, it's very achievable. And we were lucky to secure an excellent partner in our SPAC partner, Decarbonisation Plus Acquisition Corp 2, who are a Riverstone SPAC, which is a special purpose acquisition company. So a company set up to take another company to the market. And in that partnership, we found, an excellent partner who had the same goals and values as us. So the decarbonisation SPAC had been established with, obviously, the intent of taking a company that was all about decarbonisation to the market. And their number one priority in seeking companies at that point was the electrification of transport. So there was great synergies, of course, with what we're doing. And that helped a lot in that we have shared goals and values and mission. And, that sort of supported us and meant that there was a very strong trust-based relationship in getting through what became a relatively rocky market by the end of 2021. And, certainly by the time we hit the market had turned enormously from where it was at the start of 2021. But that being said, with a good strength of a company that's got a lot of fundamentals behind it in terms of revenue, existing customers, market share, I'm sure we'll find that over time the market will sort the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, in terms of clean tech companies, and we'll see that value start to shine through for all of those that have listed. In terms of our US footprint, though, we already had a facility and have had for a number of years in Los Angeles, and that's where we have sales and customer support staff at a logistics facility which distributes our charges, and then it does spares and repairs. And that facility did have some small manufacturing capability, but when we assessed it, as we had with COVID and everyone was looking at what you're doing with your manufacturing, it didn't have the expansion capacity that we needed to meet demand. It was also in a very expensive location for manufacturing. So if you sort of thought about what activities you would want to have side by side, it's not necessarily sales and customer support along with manufacturing. So we started to look strategically at where we would manufacture. And we plan now to open our biggest global factory in Tennessee in July of this year. And part of that was just that the Los Angeles facility, as I said, was going to be an expensive location, but it also could only fit 2 production lines, whereas this facility that we have now secured in Tennessee with a lease will have the ability to start at 4 and then move up to 7 production lines. Now, we had always planned to open a US factory this year, but President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law, which sets aside $5 billion in formula funding for EV charging infrastructure and then another $2.5 billion in competitive grants for equitable charging infrastructure, that was released in March last year, and that drove demand enormously for our products. It also went up even further as that bill was passed into law. And so what we saw was a material change in our revenue mix and our business globally. So at the start of last year, even in Q1, 70% of our revenue came from Europe. We traditionally had made all of our money in Europe, which is the most mature electric vehicle market. But what we saw was by the end of 2021, 43% of our revenue came from North America and 43% came from Europe. So it evened out the revenue mix for the company. And that demand, coupled with the bipartisan infrastructure law, which also will push into the Buy America Act, brought forward our plans for a US factory and to materially increase the size of that factory. We had initially planned to open it with the capacity to build 5,000 units a year, which is what we can build in our Brisbane factory. But now it's going to open with a 10,000 unit capacity and be expandable up to 30,000 units per year. So that is really being driven very much by the changes in the law. And of course, what we're seeing globally is that countries tend now to favour onshore manufacturing. It's part of what we've seen since COVID is really a drive to have local manufacturing. And we see that with the Buy America and Buy American provisions that exist in the States. As you touched on, Joe, we were very honoured to be invited by President Biden's administration to attend the White House in January. It was not long after we rang the bell. So actually, I had just left New York to fly back to our offices in LA as we had listed, and we suddenly got the call, which was actually quite different in that where we had started was I was going to go to DC to meet with Secretary Granholm, the Energy Secretary. And then we heard with COVID that wasn't going to happen. It was going to be virtual. Then we heard we would be meeting with the Undersecretary. So I left New York. And then when I hit LA, we heard that actually we were going to give a speech and then introduce the president and walk around and show him some of our products in a clutch environment. So obviously I hopped straight back on a plane and across the country back to DC. And so that, of course, was an amazing start to our life as a publicly listed company in America. It temporarily drove our share price through the roof. We were all in lockup, so it didn't make any difference to us. But it certainly was exciting to watch. We were actually the most traded stock on the NASDAQ on that day. And it was something we had to keep very, very tight, obviously, because we knew it was going to impact the share price, and we weren't even able to tell our families. So, look, it was really an amazing start to our official opening of the Tennessee factory. We couldn't have hoped to do that in a larger forum in North America. And I might hand back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Jane. And what a fantastic story. And of course, the flying the back and forth across the country as, with the updates. So that's great. What a great story. And of course, what a fantastic year it's been for you so far. And appreciate you sharing some of the details around the policy implications and how that's really opened up the opportunities for you across the US. That's fantastic to hear. And one thing that we'll touch on shortly as well is what you mentioned about locations around the US. When businesses, of course, are looking at the US market, understanding the different areas. So I'd love to learn a little bit more shortly about, your expansion in Tennessee specifically. But Tim, I'll go to you now. Keen to learn more about Redflow's work in the US. And see if you could share a bit more about your story to date. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna, and it's just so wonderful hearing about Tritium, and I think a very exciting time, experience, and a very exciting opportunity going forward, especially with President Biden's support. So for Redflow, we've had a very exciting, I think, last 12 months focused on the US market. As I mentioned before, we were delighted to have secured a 2 megawatt-hour project, which is our largest ever deployment with Energia in California, and last year was all about ramping up for that. We really view that as a reference deployment. As I mentioned before, the United States is the largest energy storage market in the world, but we're also seeing some very strong positive macro drivers that we think means that the market for us in particular as an energy storage company that's focused on medium to longer term energy storage is very attractive. As I think we've heard before, there's a lot of accelerating renewable energy commitments and deployments that's now happening in the US. But that's also bringing a number of challenges in terms of curtailment, as was mentioned before, but also grid reliability and stability. And, with lithium being the dominant energy storage solution, there's emerging concerns and evidence of, some of the fire risk around lithium-based solutions. But also, I suppose, given the geopolitical world that we see ourselves in at the moment, much more focus on energy security, both in terms of sourcing materials within the US, but also, as Jane mentioned before, that emphasis on localized manufacturing. And alongside that, I suppose we see a lot of active support for non-lithium energy storage solutions that can commercialize quickly to really meet much more of that kind of renewable energy penetration needs. And so part of our energy project we've had in the US has had the active support of the California Energy Commission. And so you're seeing institutions like that, but also at the federal level, really starting to think about how they can support companies that are really at the tip of commercialization and ramp up, such as us, getting across that and helping scale up, including for people like the CEC, but also for the US DOE with grants and loans that we think are very applicable to us. And alongside that, you're getting very strong support by people like Secretary Granholm that have been talking about flow batteries and the importance of flow batteries to the future of the US grid. So taking all of those kind of points together, we think it's a really exciting time for us. We learned a lot over the last 12 months, and I suppose like a lot of companies on this panel are quite heavily affected by the impacts of COVID, just in terms of freight delays, our ability to actually get people to travel over the US to support some of that installation. And so we've had to navigate some pretty uncertain waters over the last 12 months to get that system implemented. But at the same time as that key milestone, we've also, putting our eye on what are some of the strategic foundations that we need to establish in the US to be successful. And some of those really start with great people. And as I said before, we're delighted to have kind of announced our US executive and our team in the US that's going to be based out of California earlier on this week. But also one of the key things that we've been looking at is, what are the standards that we have to adhere to in the US, particularly around fire safety, which is a large concern for a lot of companies. How do we navigate some of those? How do we navigate some of the local requirements for installation of energy storage around the country? And it varies at state level, but even local jurisdiction level. So that's something that we've had to kind of navigate and are still navigating in terms of the target markets where we are. But fundamentally, we see that there is the right market conditions, there's the right government support, and both vocal but also incentive-wise for us to focus on the US. But we also realise as the US is 50 states, and for a smaller company like us, you really have to allocate your scarce resources very carefully. And for us, it's going to be a focus on the markets in California and probably Texas, where we feel that there's the most opportunity. But naturally, we see as we start to ramp up our business, establishing operation centres in the US and even potentially manufacturing in the future is definitely kind of part of our focus as we kind of lean into wrapping up our activity there.
Thank you, Tim. That's great, and great to hear about the announcements of your team in California. That's very exciting to hear. Okay, and I'd love to touch a little bit more on the California and Texas side. I mean, those two massive states, so we'll touch on that in environment. Dr. Gemma Green, I'd like to now pass to you and learn a bit more about, what was the key driver that led you to focus on the US market?
And there's a lot of factors that had us turn our attention. There's been like a strong history around growing renewable energy targets and also government support. Under the Obama administration, there was the tax credit system, which led to really significant growth in large scale wind and
Fantastic. Well, that's great to hear, and congratulations to you and the team. That's excellent. So Patrick, I'll look to you now. You work with a broad range of businesses going to the US. What do you see, and what tell me about the companies that you see entering the US?
Well, it's all very exciting, and I think I would say that the clients we've worked with and the companies we've worked with really represent a broad range of sectors, all I think coming at the whole idea of clean tech or renewables or environmental issues from different perspectives. So agricultural equipment providers, consultants, urban design companies, manufactured good products, a variety of different I think, market entry points. I would agree with the other speakers that U.S. policy settings have been really critical in this, as well as developments in industry and in government markets as well, which are things that are drawing Australian companies into the United States. One interesting thing I did want to mention is, I think everyone here, the other three speakers, have established a U.S. entity to do business, and of course, seeking funding in the United States is now a path that various companies have followed as well. But there are all sorts of different ways that we've seen companies entering into the market in the first place. And that might be exporting products or technology transfers. I'm thinking particularly in areas of equipment and things like that. Or it might be partnering with U.S. firms, and that's been mentioned already. And strategic partners is a really critical way some of our clients have entered the U.S. market. Establishing their own facilities, Tim was mentioning that as well. I think, as well as Jane, the initial footprint that you have in the United States might be sales and technical support, whatever. And then ultimately setting up something more substantial and also, getting to the point where you can meet the market, maybe through investment in the United States. All of these different strategies, of course, have different types of issues that you have to take account of, whether they be federal, state, or local. And, I'm happy to get into that a little bit, time permitting.
Thank you, Patrick. That's great. And so now, Jane, I'd like to come back to you. One of the things that I think is of interest to businesses when they're looking at the US is understanding location. Knowing that the US is such a big market, navigating where to be based or where to start in the US can sometimes be one of the biggest challenges. So I'd like to learn a little bit more about your experience so far, particularly with your business in LA. But a question is, why Tennessee and the drivers for establishing the facility there?
Yeah, thanks, Joan. We're probably a good example of exactly what was touched on before by Patrick, being the perhaps the staging post that you establish first, which might do just technical support and sales, and then expanding out from that, and why you might choose a different location as you expand out that footprint. Because we certainly had in mind that we might do some small scale manufacturing in our Los Angeles facility, but on scaling, it became clear that that was not going to be the right site for that. And so, as you establish that beachhead, it may not be the right site for you longer term in terms of expansion. So we certainly started in Torrance, Los Angeles, and the drivers at that time were quite different for us in making that site selection criteria. They were very much around the Californian market being by far the biggest market in North America for electric vehicles. That was by far the strongest market in the country. A lot of customers were based there. It had the largest uptake of EVs within the state. And that state in particular was also ahead of all of the other states. So it just made sense for us to co-locate there. We'd be close to our customer base and we could talk to their CEOs, face to face. And then there was also the convenience of that location as both a port and an international airport. So being a manufacturer who had to bring products in, it was great to have that co-location with our logistics facility where we could bring stuff from the port of Long Beach and the port of Oakland, who actually became customers of ours, interestingly, as they electrify their own fleets with little trucks that pull the shipping containers. That's really accessible. The LAX is incredibly accessible for Australian flights. So one of the things you'll find with Australia is we just don't fly into many sites in America directly. You've really got LA, sometimes San Francisco, sometimes Dallas, but depending on COVID. And now we see with COVID, we've gone back to pretty much LA, and there's not a lot of other choices. So from that perspective, it was the right decision at that time. It's also, the site we chose in Torrance is 20 minutes from LAX, so it's very convenient to fly in, fly out, get straight to the office. Whereas Lebanon, Tennessee, on the other hand, for us was an entirely different decision as we scaled. It will be our largest global factory. We obviously needed to be very driven by the return on investment and the cost that we could build for in that state. So as we looked at the criteria there, we hired 2 location assessment specialist firms. And I think Duncan was speaking about that as something that's offered to Australian companies. That's great to hear, and it's not an inexpensive project when you're hiring specialist firms to support you in that selection of criteria. And certainly we went through a lengthy process defining the criteria, assessing them, and then presenting a business case to the board once we'd narrowed the states down to 2. We ended up narrowing them down to Texas and Tennessee. We hired 2 contractors who are currently on staff to run the project, one with experience in establishing factories, so he'd established factories for Amazon in the past, and then another who's a specialist in manufacturing facilities, so who could help with the selection of the actual building, the flow of that building, all of those details, having the right car parking and the right selection. So some of the criteria that we looked at were things like what other high-tech firms had operations in Middle Tennessee. For us, with our investor base, our ESG credentials are important, so we did want to co-locate with other businesses that would have the right reputations and the right type of workforce. And in Middle Tennessee, we found there were companies located there like Nissan, Mitsubishi, Dell, Schneider, Oracle, Amazon, so high-tech companies. We had defined some knockout criteria, and they helped us reduce the states down to about 5 before we narrowed them to 2. And they included factors like labour, so wages, unemployment rates, the availability of labour laws, accessibility. We needed both domestic and international flight availability and a reasonable density of population. And then we had the hazard risk scores, so that's things like fires, floods, tornadoes, what might happen to your factory. And of course, the time zones, we needed a favourable overlap with the working hours in Brisbane because our engineering staff are located in Queensland. So it's very difficult if you only have, for example, in Europe, I believe we have about 1 hour of overlap at about 5 p.m, 4 to 5 p.m. You get 1 hour, which is kind of 8 a.m. in Amsterdam, and that gets quite tricky. So having a material overlap helps a lot doing business, which is why the West Coast is really favourable to Queensland businesses. And then on the basis of that criteria, we narrowed that down to Texas and Tennessee. We explored sites, 4 different sites, so 2 in each, in great detail, where we were talking to both the state in terms of incentives and grants, as well as talking to the landlords at those sites. What we found on our ROI is that both of the states were neck and neck. They were both very welcoming. Tennessee may have been marginally ahead of Texas, but we certainly had great interactions with government officials in both of those states. And the biggest determinant in the end for us became the site that we'd selected. So the site we selected had a very favourable landlord who offered very good terms. It was a former Toshiba factory where they were building televisions, which meant it was very suitable for our high-end manufacture because it already had the HVAC and heating that we needed in place, and that ended up pulling the business case ahead for that particular site by quite a material amount. So it's a project, it's a lengthy process, and it's certainly worth putting in the time, effort and money, because making the incorrect decision will take you years to extract yourself out of and is costly and will continue to cost you on an OPEX basis every year that you're doing business in the wrong location. So it's an upfront time investment that's well worth making.
Thank you for sharing that, Jane. And I think it's very helpful to understand the process that Tritium's gone through, both establishing that initial base in the US, but then, of course, as you seek to expand, why Tennessee made sense for this next stage of growth. Tim, interested in learning about your work in California, and also you touched on Texas as well, about the work that you're doing in both those states, but also how you've worked with clients and partners in building out your growth in those areas. Sorry, Tim, we've got you on mute.
That's right. So look, we're a flow battery company, and I think increasingly recognised flow batteries are recognised, as I said before, by people like Dr. Alan Finkel and Secretary Granholm as having an important role in the future energy ecosystem. And as you're starting to get more and more EVs that Jane Hunter will love, you're actually seeing those energy requirements skyrocket over the next kind of 10 years. And really what we're seeing at the moment is people starting to look beyond lithium in terms of the duration requirements, but also starting to see some of those fire risks, but also some of those supply chain risks. So very often what we're doing is first we're educating, just letting people know that there's an alternative technology out there, and the fact that we've been around for quite some time, and we've now sort of delivered over 2 gigawatt hours of energy through our batteries. But as we start to go forward, some of those considerations about who we want to partner with, who really our end customers are, and what locations we want to focus on become really critical in terms of our strategy. And certainly from our perspective, we think the kind of commercial industrial areas is very important. And that's going to allow us to kind of expand into larger form size, but also allow us to then also start to target the utility sector. And California and Texas are really interesting for us, probably for a couple of different reasons. As Jane mentioned, California is the largest market for us. It's vibrant. It's got some very strong state support. And you're also starting to see we've got a reference product, but allowing us to expand adjacent to those. Texas is a little bit of a different story because we've got a lot of corporates that have some major operational centres there that have some very deep commitments to sustainable energy, and a lot of those were quite deeply affected by the Texas freeze that only occurred last year, with skyrocketing energy prices, but the whole element about needing to reassure themselves that they've got energy security, but also it's sustainable green energy as well. So we're seeing a lot of interest in terms of both of those markets. So part of our strategy is to kind of engage with end customers to educate them and make them familiar with our world-leading technology, but at the same time start to engage with a number of engineering, procurement and construction companies that are really going to be the people who are going to execute for us on the ground, because our battery system will usually be part of a larger, broader renewable energy system. And so we've had a number of those dialogues going for some blue chip EPC companies that are very interested in looking at alternatives to lithium as you start to look forward. So we're really at the start of our journey, I suppose. In the US, we're very excited about that opportunity, but we also realise that there's a real, I suppose, risk that you kind of look at the size of the market and you go too thin across too many areas without kind of establishing the progress that we need to do over the next 12 months. So we're going to probably have a little bit more of a narrow focus over the next 12 months and then start to expand from there as we start to build some momentum in target markets and geographies that I talked about.
Thank you, Tim. And I mean, that's right, isn't it? With, huge markets like California and Texas, bigger than some countries. I know California being, the larger market than the UK in terms of the economy. So it's the opportunities there are significant. It's, like you said, important to approach that with that in mind, knowing that the US is not just one major market. It's obviously very fragmented and very different business cultures and jurisdictions. So, Georgie, I know we're just hitting time now, and Georgie, are there any questions that come from Q&A that you can ask?
Duncan, I think you have one question that's come through.
What's that, Georgie? Sorry, I can't see it.
So the question we got is in regards to understanding a bit more about the Select USA resources offered and whether we offer a tailored program for companies attending the summit.
In terms of, if I've understood the question right, in terms of the resources, in terms of market research, typically the way that we would go about that program is simply to have a discussion with the Australian company, then be in touch with our team in DC, the Select USA team, and we would have a similar discussion around the kind of parameters of what the research would look like and what sort of information the Australian company is looking for in terms of that process of identifying the right region, the right state, the right county, that sort of thing. And then, as all of the speakers were talking about, it's really critical to then have a conversation at that state and local level, because they're the ones that are going to be able to give you the information on incentives that the states will offer to an Australian company that's setting up. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a full-scale manufacturing plant. They're just super aggressive to speak to any company about anyone who's going to hire American citizens and put their flagship, US facility in their jurisdiction. In terms of tailored services, we can certainly have a discussion around what sort of meetings companies would be looking for. They're typically reasonably easy to facilitate if it's federal government agencies. And it's also worth pointing out that at the summit, you're going to be able to meet with 50 economic development officers from virtually every state in the US. So they're all going to be there in a kind of like in a trade show format, if you will, and so you can walk around a huge booth, or rather a huge hall that has all of these different states, and you can go and speak to anyone there. But we can certainly talk to any Australian company about how we can assist once you're on the ground in the States. I hope that helps.
Thanks. No, that's great. We've just had one question come through for Jane Hunter. How much of the management team in the USA are from the Australian team, and is this important to their strategy? Over to you, Jane.
Yeah, great question. So we have a US president who leads sales for us in the United States, who's a local hire, and he's the most senior person that we have working over in the US. He was formerly the CEO of one of our peers and customers, Blink, so a very senior operator in his own right. As we've listed on the NASDAQ, we certainly have an intent to increase some of the senior roles that we have based in the US. So for example, our general counsel, we're currently recruiting somebody in the US. As you can imagine, it changes your risk profile. So for us, what had previously been our material risks were based under Australian law. Now our most material risks are based under US law, particularly directors and officers' duties and so on for a listed company. So that changes the key location. And we'll find that a couple of our other most senior executive roles will end up needing to be based over in the US. So the other thing we're recruiting currently is a VP for investor relations, which is something we've never needed before as a private company, but now we have an investor relations work stream, and that person's likely to be based in New York, which is where the core of our investors are based. So what we'll see is that those specialist roles will probably migrate to the US, where we need people who are steeped in that market and grew up in that market. And we're likely to keep our core R&D base of engineers in Australia, where we've grown that core base of R&D and technology leaders. But we'll certainly see a change in some of those most senior roles in the company.
Great, thank you, Jane. And I know that we've just gone over time, so we might just stop there and end with our final question, which is to all our panelists, which is, I mean, we have so much more that we could discuss with everything and all the different growth plans and the experiences so far from you all. But one thing we'd like to leave the audience with is, if you have, one sentence piece of advice or anything that you think might be helpful as they look to expand to the US. Tim, might start with you.
Look, I think, from our perspective, there's an enormous amount of resources and support that you can pull on as you're starting to look for expansion into the US. I think, as Duncan mentioned before, Select USA are an incredible organisation that has a lot of support. They've helped us kind of put us on to the National Institution of Standards and Technologies to look at potential US local support. We've had brilliant support from DFAT and Australia as we've started to do our ventures. So for a company that might be in a position like us that's establishing that beachhead and that initial kind of staging post in the US, there's a huge amount of people who are very standby active to support you. And so lean into them, because they provide a great resource. They build on that experience. And they'll help you make the right decisions as you start to go forward to those initial steps.
Great. And Gemma, do you have one piece of advice for companies looking at the US?
Well, I think that it's a very big market. You want to understand exactly like what who your core customer is, what segments that you want to focus on, and definitely use the the US government support and the Australian government support to facilitate entry into the market, be introduced to key potential clients. I would say there's a lot of resources available between the two government entities, and I think that will help significantly.
Great, thank you. Patrick, you work with a number of companies. What advice do you have?
Jo, I think Patrick's dropped off the line, so if we go to Jane.
Not a problem. Jane, we'll close out with you. Advice that you'd like to share with our audience today.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Just two quick pieces of advice, if I can. One, it's very important to have a physical presence in the US, and that goes for all global markets. Having worked in other international markets before, you need to establish a base there. You need to travel there regularly for face-to-face meetings. That's been hard during COVID, but this includes you've got to hire local staff with good local business networks, not just put in expats. And that goes for the States. It also goes for markets like Japan and South Korea, where it's just so important to have somebody there who understands the local lay of the land and has a good business network there. In terms of strategic partnerships, I just wanted to offer something of a warning, which is you should be very careful not to limit your business with, for example, lengthy exclusivity arrangements in order to enter a new market, because it's fundamentally your business. Nobody else is going to be better placed or more motivated to drive business growth than you are. And you might find that you want to wrest back control of that market from your partner much sooner than you think if you get a good foothold in a market. So just need to think about the future. Don't enter a 3-year agreement. Think about short-term, sort of 12-month agreements. There'll always be people who are very happy to enter exclusive arrangements with you if you've got a good product, but it's not something that I'd recommend for a multi-year arrangement.
Some wise advice there, Jane, on that note, and also some important advice there on the importance of the team when you're building that out. So thank you again. Thank you to all our panelists, to Jane, Gemma, Tim, and Patrick. Thank you all so much for sharing your experiences. It's fantastic to learn more. And to our audience so far, to have joined us today, thank you. That's also great. We've hoped that you've learnt a lot from these business leaders about expanding to the US. And don't forget, please reach out to All Online, to Select USA, to Georgie, Duncan, and to Mark about how they can continue to support you, including learning more about the Select USA Summit. So Georgie, I'll pass back over to you.
Thanks, Joe. The diversity of the companies represented really echo the diversity of the US. You know, from Tennessee in the south to California in the west, we're so happy to hear just how successful your businesses have been in the States. And despite what Tim said, the waters have been rocky over the last few years around the world. The US is back to business, and we hope you'll join us in June in Washington for the Select USA Summit. Thanks, Joe, for doing such a great job on the panel, and to all our presenters. Hope you have a good rest of the day. If you're in Sydney, keep dry and take it easy. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Joe. Thanks, Georgie.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.